Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the homework review for Introduction to Biblical Languages. We are in week 4 and dealing primarily with verbs, though we'll jump back into nouns as well. Okay, so I'm not going to go through all the counting of the tenses. I think most of you seem to have used my little tip from last week to determine the number of each, and were successful in noticing that the present tense was the most commonly used, with 47, and you probably notice that there are quite a few imperatives in this chapter, which I thought was significant. Also want to just point out that if you read through them, they've translated a lot of them in ways that kind of obscures that they are in fact imperatives. For instance, in the very first verse, my brothers, show no partiality as you hold, which is actually an imperative verb, and you wouldn't expect it to look that way. In fact, I won't show you the Greek because we aren't studying necessarily what the Greek language looks like, but the way it's presented in the text almost seems like it should be translated, my brothers, hold the faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory, with no partiality. So for some reason the translators have softened that a bit, and turn the show no partiality into the imperative idea, when in fact it's not even a verb. So there's just a wonderful little anecdotal example of why it's important to know the Greek language enough to look at what the translators are doing and begin to ask some questions. But I digress. Let's jump back into the actual homework here. Okay, so I asked you to put your cursor on the English word distinction in verse 4. List the person, number, tense, voice, mood of the verb. How many English words are used to translate this one Greek word? Now, I bring this up and I want to point back to a question that Barb asked in the forums, where she pointed out that I think it was a thread that was started by Laura Lee, who pointed out have become slaves. And Barb said, well, that looks like have become should be a deponent verb, but it's not. Why is that? And so let's go ahead and look at that. Have you not then made distinctions? So distinctions is highlighted blue, right? And that tells you that it's the aorist tense, because that's how I've marked my aorists. Verb, aorist, passive, indicative, second person plural would be the answer to the question. As to how you parse it, that is, list all the details. But then if you start to scroll over words, so if you look at the Greek word down at the bottom, it says diakrino. You can kind of just memorize how it looks. Go back to made, same word. Then, same word. Not is a u, which is a particle, so that's a different word. You, same word again, diakrino. Have, diakrino. So have you then made distinctions are the 5 words that are used to translate this one Greek verb. And so that's the kind of stuff you need to be looking for when you're looking at verbs before you jump to conclusions about how they've been translated, and whether or not they should or should not be deponent and so on. You need to make sure that you're actually looking at all the English words that are tied into the translator's translation of that particular verb. All right, so that's a useful exercise whenever you're trying to analyze a text. All right, and this was just a fascinating little thing that I came upon in my study of the book of James that I am now transferring on to you for further speculation and thought. As you look at verse 22, there are 3 consecutive verbs, and they are all in different tenses. So using the chart in the lecture regarding the nuances of time and significance, what do you think these verbs are trying to communicate? Now, this is a fairly high level, that's why it's the last question that I included, of thinking, and it's going to be, I didn't expect you to necessarily nail this, though some of you definitely had some good explanations of what you think you see going on here. So the first verb that we encounter is you see. Once again, this is an obscured. I'm sorry. No, it's not. Never mind. This is actually a present active indicative. I thought it was an imperative for some reason, but it's not. So this is a present tense, which, if you remember from the lectures, tends to carry with it a continuous idea. So even though the translators translated as you see, it kind of has the idea of you are in the process of seeing. So in English, the present continuous, you are seeing, could be a way that you would nuance this. So you are seeing that faith was active. Here's our next tense, which is imperfect, which, if you remember from the lecture, is a past continuous idea. So you are currently seeing that faith was active in the past. And this is actually going to play into our answer for the noun question that I asked, which some of you have some opinions about. So we'll engage that in a second. So you are currently in the present seeing that faith was active in the past, along with his works, namely referring to Abraham in this particular instance, specifically in the event of his offering his son Isaac on the altar. And faith was completed. Here we have a perfect tense, which, if you remember, means carries with the meaning that something happened in the past and its effects carry on into the present by his works. So the nuance being that you currently, existing right now, are seeing that Abraham's faith was active along with his works, and that his faith was completed and its effects are continuing on into the present, which is clearly a New Testament theme, both in Paul and James, by his works. So those are kind of the nuances that you can pull out of the text, that James is, I think, very intentionally using these tenses to include his audience, saying what they are seeing in the present, to the past, what was happening and is no longer happening. But because it happened and was completed or made complete, that the effects of that particular action, namely his faith or faithfulness, carry on into the present. Okay, so let's then jump into our noun and adjective review. Now, all of you seem to grab onto the attributive adjectives. I just wanted to throw that in there just to make sure you're still thinking about that, because those things still exist in the language. But really, I wanted you to grapple with the this genitive here, Jesus. So, probably unbeknownst to you, unless you've taken a few New Testament classes, I have thrown you into the deep end of a fairly lengthy and deep conversation about the phrase and they occur in several places throughout the New Testament, primarily in Paul, but here also in James, I think, about the faith in Jesus, or, because it's a genitive, the faith of Jesus. Now, many of you saw that this is probably a noun with a verbal quality, and as I've kind of spelled out in later on with the Abraham allusion, clearly it's talking about an activity that he completed and in order to describe his faith. And I think this is actually fundamental to the book of James, is that faith is not something that happens, as if you ever take Andy Johnson or Dr. Johnson, he will say, something that happens between your ears. It's something that you're doing. Faith, you can't just think faith. You can't just believe. There is no such biblical concept. Faith is an action. It is something that you do, and it is displayed in your works. These are not one happens in your brain and one comes out of your body or your hands. They are both actions. Believing or being faithful and working are two different ways that you display your allegiance to God. But they are not mutually exclusive in some way. I can do this one and not this one. That's exactly what James is trying to point out. Okay, so this is a verbal noun, which means you're dealing with either a subjective or an objective genitive. And many of you have rightly noted that the translators here have chosen this as an objective genitive. Hold the faith in our Lord Jesus. So in this case, Lord would be an objective genitive, right? The faith displayed for our Lord, not this faith displayed by. Now, I'm going to argue that that is not the best option, because the word faith makes us assume that it is our faith. But if you go back down with me to the example that James gives us here in verse 22, whose faith is he exemplifying? He's exemplifying Abraham's. And in this particular case, he is not comparing Abraham's faith with our faith, I would argue. He is comparing Abraham's faith with Jesus's faith. But this is where that word faith becomes tricky and, in my opinion, somewhat misleading. Faith is not belief. Faith is faithfulness. That is active participation in the will of God. And in this case, what is being lauded about Abraham is his active participation and action regarding what God has asked him to do. In other words, he is in accordance with God's will. His faithfulness is what is exemplary. Okay? So when we go back then to this opening phrase, my brothers and sisters, hold to the faithfulness of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Lord of glory, with no partiality. Now, one of you made the comment, it is not by Jesus's faith that we are saved. It is by our faith. I think that's actually backwards from the biblical testimony. It is by the faithfulness of Jesus that we are saved, not by our own. It is not by our own belief that we are saved. It is by the faithfulness of Jesus Christ and then our subsequent faithfulness to that same Jesus that we participate in his kingdom and thus display our salvation. So, this is probably going to be a fairly controversial interpretation. In fact, it is, not just in our class, but among scholars. But it is a fairly, I think, strong argument, not just grammatically, but theologically and ethically and ecclesiologically. And so I would ask you to reflect on that and see what you think about it. I will post this video and then I'll post a forum right underneath it, and I really would like to hear some of your responses to that interpretation, that what we are holding to is not our faithfulness, but rather the faithfulness of our Lord Jesus Christ to the will of his Father to die on the cross. And it is by means of this that then we can be faithful so that we can participate in his kingdom. I look forward to hearing your thoughts, and I am really enjoying the work that you're doing in this class. Thank you so much for all of your effort. I will see you in the forums.